to Just Between Us, where we taste test the worst candy so you don't have to.
Oh my god, I just got flashbacks.
So this week I thought we would talk about writing books. Because we've written books, multiple books, and I feel like people are always like, oh, how do you write a book?
It was a job.
Yeah.
You wake up, you start writing, and then it's just like your job.
Well, I wanted to take people through like the process of like selling a book and then writing a book and like all the different like parts.
Yeah, okay.
Basically, you sell a book, you have to have a book agent. Like most publishers won't read a manuscript unless you have a book agent. So a lot of like young writers, a big part of what they have to do is they have to query agents to try to find a book agent that will represent them. So once you've got your book agent, then it depends if you're writing fiction or nonfiction. With fiction, pretty much, and I'm talking about people's first books because obviously once you are an established author, things can be different. You have relationships, maybe you're working on a series, yada yada. So this is like first time. And so it's different for fiction and nonfiction, where fiction you pretty much need to have the full manuscript. Like the whole book needs to kind of be written. That doesn't mean that there won't be tons of changes, but like there's an expectation that you have the full draft. With nonfiction, a lot of nonfiction sells on proposal. And so proposal will sort of be like an introduction, an explanation of what it is, a breakdown of what your different chapters are, and then also a couple sample chapters so that people kind of know what they're getting. And so those are just two totally different approaches, right? Like one is like this thing is like kind of fully formed, and the other is like, well, it's up for interpretation. I hope I deliver the book that I sold you. So I would imagine that with querying, it would be similar. My guess is you probably, if you're just querying, my guess is you probably need to have quite a bit of both types. If you don't have like an established audience. So then your agent gives you notes. If they're a good agent, you make those notes. And then they send it out to editors that they think would be a good fit for it. And so then you're out, you're submitted, you're on sub or whatever. And then it's like, I feel like I used to be like, okay, and I'll hear back tomorrow. But really it takes like weeks and weeks to hear back from people. But sometimes people get back to you quickly, depending. And then if there's like multiple interests in the book, then often your agent will do what's like an auction. And so it's like you have to get your offer in on a certain day. And then like that day people will put in like their best offers, or maybe they'll try to top another offer. Often I think it's like put in your best and final offer kind of thing. And then your agent will be like, we got these offers. I've only ever had two at a time. No, our first book, I feel like we had three. We had three.
We had three.
And then you pick which is obviously the better choice.
Yeah.
Basically, you'll get an intro with your editor. And then you'll probably have had a call with your editor before they make an offer. Do you feel like, I feel like that is, we had that with Sarah, and then I have had that with my other books.
Yeah, or I went in New York, I think, and talked to my editor for Bad with Money.
Yeah, what was that submission like?
Well, that was wild because Simon & Schuster had been one of the places that wanted our novel, and they didn't get it. We went with Wednesday, and then when I was selling Bad with Money, we went back to Simon & Schuster, and we're like, hey, I know you wanted Allison and Gabe, but what if we just gave you Gabe? And they were like, okay. And so they took it from a proposal. So I had written like a book proposal for it. Yeah. I've written a lot of book proposals in my life. Not all of them have sold. Like I had a literary agent when I was 24 or 23 living in New York. And I wrote many proposals. None of them sold. And then we actually ended up using the title of one of my proposals for I Hate Everyone But You. I have written other proposals that haven't sold. So it really just like depends. Those were all for nonfiction. Was like various proposals that short story collections, things that I was trying to sell when I was younger. Didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to sell a book, especially if you don't have like an established audience of some kind.
Yeah.
Or some sort of fame or even notoriety.
Doesn't
notoriety will help you sell a book.
Well, I was going to say, like, I have a novel right now that I've been working on for like a couple of years, has not sold. Very strange to me, but I don't know. It just, the market's not right for it. I don't really know. We like had a period of time where it was like, oh, you have a lot of followers, so you'll have a book. Like, I remember they wanted us to do like a YouTuber book, and you pushed for us to do an actual novel.
Well, I thought we would have to do like a nonfiction book, like a YouTuber book, and then our agent at UTA at the time said that no, we could pitch a novel.
Yeah.
And so then we were like, great, we have this idea, and then we like ran with that.
Yeah. But there was like a period of time when I lived in New York where around similar time, like I would say there's a 5-year span where if you had like a YouTube channel, you could put out like a picture book.
Yes.
Or like an Urban Outfitters book.
Right.
And so I think that maybe the thing of having a lot of followers and then writing a book, that is fading, I think.
Yeah, I mean, because it was sort of like merch.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Like, it was like, this is idea that like, no matter what you wrote, you had fans that would buy it.
Correct.
But so I don't know how many of those people then wrote like second or third books.
Right. I know.
Because like book writing isn't their main thing or what they want to do. Yeah. And so then once you're like working with your editor, if it's like nonfiction, then you have to go write the book.
Yeah.
And so I think that involved a lot of interviewing. So I had to do like all of this interviewing to find both like experts and then also like real life couples. And so then I would just like, for real life couples, I like put out a blast on social media and was like, does anyone want to tell me about their experience with marriage or divorce or whatever? Mm-hmm. I got a lot of replies there. So then it was like weeding through that and figuring out who I wanted to talk to, and also like whose story would fit in what chapter, because there's all these stories that are like interesting, but each chapter had a theme. And so like I had to figure out like what was relevant and what stories were different enough to like be getting enough different perspectives and inputs. Mm-hmm. And then with experts, like I would just look up like divorce lawyer. And then I would just like, I like cold called people for this book. Like cold emailed more so, but like I just like cold contacted tons of people.
You're a journalist.
Well, some would argue I'm not.
No, you're a journalist. That's journalism, baby.
Yeah, and so I would just be like, here I am. This is about me. This is the project. Like I had Overthinking About You, so I was like, I'm already a published author, you know, and then setting up like Zooms with these people. Mm-hmm. And so then I would have like a Zoom, and on the Zoom I would be recording the Zoom and also like taking notes. And then I had so many hours of audio and video. I was like, well, I need this transcribed, but I think I will lose my mind if I transcribe this.
Yeah.
And so I hired an assistant who had worked on your book.
Emily.
She used like a tool that did a transcript for you automatically. Yeah. And then she went in and made sure things were correct. Yeah. So it saved a lot of time.
Emily Parsons. Yep. Great book assistant.
Great book assistant. And so she then did all the transcripts for me. And so then I'm going through all the transcripts and figuring out like, okay, what the fuck am I doing? Where do I use this for that? Like, how is it? Because writing that book was a goddamn nightmare, because I'm blending my story, experts' opinions, and random people's stories. Yep. And like, what order do I tell that in? Like, how do I do this? And so the answer is you just do a bad version. Yes. And then that version's better than you thought that it was. You know, like you don't like set out to like write the best thing in history. I'm just like setting out to get it done, and then it's like, oh, I did it. Like, yeah. I need to make, I read many, that book has quite a lot of gossip around it that maybe I'll share one day. But anyway, you do your draft and then like you go through your draft and you figure it out and then you send it into the editor. And from there, then there's like multiple rounds of notes with your editor. Mm-hmm. So your editor will come back to you and be like, this is, I changed this, move this here, do that. This, I want these extra chapters. I want this extra research, all that jazz. Do that a couple times, and then finally they'll send it to copy editing, which is great because that's like the easy stuff. That's like, this comma can't be here, that comma can't be there. You go to legal will be like, this person's going to sue you because you said this, and you're like, well, oops. Yeah. And so that's sort of like the how like a nonfiction works, and I'd say that probably a lot of nonfictions end up being a little different than what the proposal was.
I mean, right. It's like documentary. Like, how do you know what's going to happen?
Yeah. And like, how do you know like what would be the most interesting? Like when I had Emily transcribe the interviews, I asked her to highlight the things she found interesting.
Yeah.
Because I was like, that'll tell me like if I'm on the right track of like what I'm drawn to too.
Yeah. What I also had Emily do was I sent all the transcripts. Once I had finished a chapter, I would make sure that from all the quotes, I would have her cross-check them with what the actual person said and make sure. And then she made a spreadsheet that was like, so they did say this, but in my opinion, they said it in this context, not in this context. So here, like, to make sure I didn't get sued.
Did you send the draft back to all the people you interviewed?
No.
I did.
You really?
It's a nightmare. I mean, writing this book has been an administrative nightmare.
Oh my God.
It's like 40 people or like whatever. And I had to like track them down and be like, here's the section that you're in. Let me know if these quotes are okay and if you want any changes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not do that.
I also made a big mistake in not getting releases up front.
I did releases, yeah.
And so I had to get releases later.
Yeah.
So I had to like track everybody down. And one person's missing. I can't find her.
Yeah, she is missing.
It's very strange.
I did releases ahead of time. Well, I had to do releases because I was interviewing high school kids. And I needed their parents to sign off.
Oh.
So I had to do that ahead of time.
I've done releases for everybody. And
yeah.
For some of them, like they want things changed, like because the people that I interview that are like just real life couples or real life people, they have fake names in the book. And they don't have like, you know, it's changed enough so you're not supposed to be able to identify them, and they wanted that reflected in the contract. You know, it's like a lot of like administrative work that like and legal work that you're also doing when you're when you're writing a book like that.
That's journalism, baby. Journalism is rough. There's a reason I don't do it anymore.
I also had to like link to all the articles that I'm referencing and do like a references thing where I for each chapter what things I pulled from. I didn't do that in Overthinking About You.
Well, Overthinking About You is a little bit more personal, maybe more memoir-y.
Yeah, it's more memoir. I mean, I interviewed maybe 13 or 14 people for Overthinking About You, and in this one I've interviewed like over 40.
Yeah.
So
it's research.
Like like just the level of undertaking was very different.
Oh yeah, and the research of it all. You know what's so funny is that there's all these things where these people, I'll say it, cis straight white men write these books and they're like just fully inaccurate, and everyone's like, oops.
Yeah, nobody fact checks books.
Nobody fact checks.
That's the thing you need to know. It's like, if it's in a book, it does not mean that it's true because nobody is fact checking.
That's why I fact checked everything so hard for mine. I made sure everything could be sourced because I was just like, I just felt like I should.
Yeah. And some stuff, like, it's hard because it's also like, this is like one study. Like, it's not necessarily like true.
Right.
So like, I tried to like give myself grace of like, and just because a study says this or just because this is a trend, like, that's not the be all end all truth.
Yeah.
And with both the novel and the nonfiction, I would approach it where I had a word count that I wanted to hit every day. And so instead of like amount of hours or like what section of the book, it would just be like I would be basing my work off of a pure word count. And once I hit a certain word count, then I had accomplished my goal for the day.
Yeah, you did that for us for the books. I'm a little bit different. I would finish chapters, or I would have like Google Docs with each chapter, and I would like finish it and then be like, that Google Doc's done. Like,
you would write a chapter a day?
No, like I would have like tasks. Like I'd be like, okay, what's missing here? So for journalism, when you don't have all the information or something's not done, you put TK. I don't really remember why. But so I would just like write something and then I would put like TK, and then something else will go here. Or like I did it as like a skeleton kind of.
Yeah.
And then I'd be like, and I think that this, and this. And then I'd be like, TK, find stuff that corroborates that. Interview someone that corroborates that. And then if I couldn't find someone to corroborate it, I'd be like, all right, well, then I got to write the other thing. I got to write it as the other thing.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I think like that was a big thing in journalism, is figuring out that you could go in with a hypothesis. Like I remember I wrote something that was like, my hypothesis is that people that are collectors are selling their collections more now. It was 2008. Are selling their collections more now because of the housing crisis. And so they don't have enough room, or they're moving, or I believe people with massive collections are selling their collections. That's my guess. And then I had to go out and figure out if that was true.
Was it?
Yeah, I wrote a front page article about it.
Ah.
I like went to like collector conventions and I put up Craigslist ads. It's 2008, you guys. Craigslist ads. Are you a collector? Are you selling your collection? Can I interview you?
When you wrote your novel, how outlined was it?
The one that didn't sell?
The one that hasn't sold yet.
Hasn't sold yet. It was pretty heavily outlined. It takes place in 2 different timelines. So it's like outlined, and I tried to make sure that each, like, going back and forth in the action, paired up, because it's supposed to be very parallel what's happening to Joe and what's happening to Michael. So it's like I made it so that it was easy to do in a way, because I was like, here are the themes and the things I want to happen. Here's how it happens in 2023, which is where it takes place, and here's how it happens in 1977. And so it would just go boom, 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 like that. So I also took a class. I also took a novel writing class. And I wrote the whole book, mostly, and it took place initially at an American Idol reality show. And then the equivalent was like this singing competition in the 70s. And then I had all of it there. And then the guy that was hosting the class, I had a one-on-one with him. And he was like, I guess my first question would be, why the reality show? And I knew it in my bones. I knew that it didn't need it. But I had just spent so much time coming up with the world of the reality show that I couldn't let it go. And then the first thing he said, and I went, I know. And so then I took out all the reality show stuff.
Yeah.
And then it was a book.
I, for my novel, had an outline in terms of like all the major plot points and where I wanted all the characters to go. Mm-hmm. But scene to scene, I had no outline.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
And so I would sit down and be like, well, what scene should I do now?
Yeah.
Where should I place this scene? What's my goal for this scene? Like, how is this going to move the plot along?
Yeah.
And so like there were some days where it was like, oh, I definitely know what scene to do here. And other days where I'm like, ooh, what?
Did you rewrite? Like, have you done rewrites on it? Like full rewrites? Mm-hmm. I had stuff where I was like, oh, this character's 2-dimensional. So then I would go back and then it would actually serve the plot to like, or like it would feel good to be like, okay, now this person's not just like a villain. He has like something.
And I was like, I don't know what your protagonist looks like. And I was like, oh, I should probably explain that.
Oh, interesting.
But I think that the best writing tip I ever read or got, or I think I read it somewhere, is like, leave the day knowing what you're going to do next. And so like, don't stop writing
when you're out of ideas.
Like stop writing kind of when you're on a roll, because then you can pick it up the next day.
Okay.
But it's like hard to stop at a difficult part.
Oh, because then you're like, frustrated.
Yeah, like then you sit down, you don't know where to go, what to do. So like a lot of times I would like write to a certain point and then like maybe start a new scene or know what the next scene was. And then I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing tomorrow.
I do that with scripts, but I haven't done that with books. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Can I tell you an unrelated thing?
Sure.
In my novel, I predicted Ice Spice. You know what's funny? I watched this TikTok where it was this person talking about being like a musical theater performer. And they were like, so many people come up and they're like, oh my God, you do the same show over and over again every day, twice a day. And she was like, you have a corporate, you go in at 9 every day. You do the same job every day till 5. How is my thing repetitive?